All right, hello. So today I want to show you something that I've been working on, which I think is pretty cool and hopefully will be useful for anyone that is looking to get into some server-side rendering. So let's just jump straight in and I will show you exactly what this does. So here's the repository. As you can see by the name and probably the title of this video or post or whatever, this is using Fastify on a node server, which is just like Express, but supposedly slightly faster. That was why I opted for it. And then it's using Preact and it's server-side rendering the Preact to send down some like pre-rendered HTML into the browser directly. So the browser just can load this HTML that it receives immediately. But then the Fastify also then hosts a static client.js file, which is the bundled Preact JavaScript, which runs on the client side and then hydrates the statically generated HTML on the client side to bring in all of the Preact goodness, like the use state. It's using Preact router as well so that it can correctly hydrate the page depending on the URL. And so basically, I just wanted to show this off. If anyone's prototyping anything or wants to play around with some server-side rendering, this will be a cool option for you. And as you can see, oh yeah, you'll get 100, 100, 100, 100. Obviously, because we're bundling up the Preact bundle into a single client.js file, that means you are pulling your Preact JavaScript for all of your pages and components in a single bundle. So as soon as you start getting to quite a few pages or components in your application, you're obviously going to start losing some performance, maybe losing some best practices because you might be blocked on this like few 100 kilobyte JavaScript file if you've got lots of stuff in there. But the perk of that is, I suppose, once that gets cached, then all of your pages will become super snappy. But if your application is fairly lightweight, like the sort of like the example setup that's in this repository, then yeah, you should expect to have pretty great performance. So I won't bother going through this because I'll do this live, but it's worth shouting out Carl McGuire, who I read his blog post basically when I was looking into this. There isn't a ton of information about Preact server-side rendering, and there was nothing at all about Fastify and Preact server-side rendering, even though Preact is built to support server-side rendering out of the box. It just doesn't seem to be very well documented. So I found Carl's blog post and it was super helpful, and that was like what really helped me get through a lot of the sort of difficult process of getting this set up. So yeah, check out his blog post as well if you want to sort of see like where this has come from, what it's inspired by. So we'll open up terminal, cd projects, and git clone this Fastify-preact-ssr repository. We'll run an npm install. Cool, there we go. Now I will open this up in Visual Studio Code and we can take a look. The one thing I want to highlight about this project that sort of makes it stand out maybe from like Next.js, which is obviously, I guess, what this is competing with, and Next.js is absolutely huge now and just dominates the sort of server-side rendered React application space. But what's nice about this as an alternative is just how lightweight it is to get started. And so obviously on the server side, we've got some Fastify dependencies. Fastify compress is optional. I'm not actually using it, but I've just left it in so that people can enable it with a simple uncomment of a line. HTM is a tiny library. This is like 550 bytes even. This is Preact is like 2 kilobytes or something tiny. Preact render to string is used only on the server, and then Preact router is itself also super tiny. And then obviously dev dependencies. The Preact CLI actually isn't used because we're using rollup to create our production bundles. So I could actually go ahead and remove this. NodeMon's obviously just used for development purposes, and rollup is used in the building of the code. But the actual like JavaScript bundle that the client receives basically just has HTML preact and preact router. And we could even add like a Babel compile step to remove HTML. I mean, at that point, we're talking about just removing like a handful of bytes. So it's really light. Yeah, pretty cool. So yeah, you can basically see in here, we've got a few pages. We've got a home page, an about page, and then we've got a few components, which if Visual Studio Code will load, you can check out how these components look. You can see this is the HTML markup style. It takes like a little bit of getting used to, but it essentially functions exactly the same as JSX. And then I tried working with styled components, but because obviously the Preact application is getting compiled into HTML on the server side, as well as being compiled into a browser compatible JavaScript bundle to be used in the browser, it means every single library that goes into your Preact application code has to be able to compile into your browser environment and into your server environment. So styled components just didn't want to play nice in the server compilation, and that's the one drawback of going with this approach is, yeah, it's super cool that you can share your Preact application code with your Fastify or even Express server, whatever you might be using, and then you can share it with your browser like application client as well. But you have to be mindful that those are two separate environments that your application is going to be built for. And although Node supports ES modules, it just doesn't quite support them in the same way that browser-based JavaScript can. So they have to be built slightly differently, and that means that some packages just won't play nicely, and styled components didn't want to play nice. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend using this if you've got a very complex application that you're trying to build lots of like very nifty little app features in that might depend on quite a few little packages. I'm using this because I'm going to be coding my application from scratch. A lot of the views are going to be pretty static, and there's only going to be a certain amount of dynamic app-like functionality and sort of user login and some sort of loading of data into the page, sort of hydration style stuff. So I don't really need to use too many libraries. I'll go ahead and show you the rollup config, which basically you can see here. This is what I'm talking about, the different environments. So we build the server in CommonJS format. I really tried getting this to work with ES modules in Node, but like I said, it's just not quite there yet. And then the client, we're building with ES modules, and we're building that into our public directory to be served. And so you can see if all of our Preact source code is here, here's client.js, which essentially just pulls in the router and then hydrates the root element in the document with the router, and the router pulls in the pages, and the pages pull in the components. So by pulling in router, we essentially pull in everything. And so if we roll up client.js, it pulls all the dependencies that client.js has and all of the dependencies that the dependencies of client.js has into a single file, which goes into public client.js here. And I'm generating source maps as well, just for debugging. So these are getting built on the when you run npm dev, because if you get an error in your JavaScript without the source map, it's a pain to debug. You'll get a compiled JavaScript error, meaningless variables. If you have your source map, it will actually tell you in the stack where that error has come from your source code files, which is obviously super helpful. These should probably be added to git ignore because they're pointless in production. So maybe I'll add anything with a .map to git ignore because they're generated on npm run dev anyway. So this client.js pulls in all of the Preact source code, and this is what gets sent down to the browser. Then we have lib server.js, And so in here, you can see we pull in pages. We're also pulling in Preact render to string and HTML. And then you can see what we do is for every page in the pages, we create an endpoint for that route. And then we send the page component and render it to HTML as a response. If you've noticed a little inefficiency here, then well spotted, because there is one. You can see we use source pages index.js in the server.js file, where we can just write everything in here, whereas in the router, we're having to import them again and define them. You can see I've commented down here, this doesn't work, just importing pages and mapping, which would be lovely. I'm sure that can work in some way, but I couldn't get it to work just now, so I'm publishing it without it. But like, yeah, if anyone fancies a PR, there you go. So yeah, I feel like that pretty much illustrates everything that's going on. Oh, one thing I will show you as well actually is we have this HTML shell. So you can see when we return for an app route, we're wrapping everything in this HTML shell with this HTML shell function. I'll just show you that HTML shell. So here I'm actually importing from package.json using a rollup JSON module, just because for me, I could get everything that I needed from my package.json. It felt stupid to sort of redefine the title, description, and keywords when I already had them. Obviously, that's probably not going to be applicable to everybody's application, but it seemed like a cool feature, so I left it in. And then you can see in the HTML that we send, we always send client.js. So that's going to pull the client bundled Preact file for client-side hydration. So if I npm run dev, we're going to roll up and then we're going to run nodemon on the server. So our roll up has completed and nodemon has restarted because obviously we've rebuilt node server.js. And so if I go, ignore my home screen, one-way road to beer.com. I mean, we're all waiting. We are all waiting. So here we go. And here we have a little React application with working state and different pages. And so when we go to one of these endpoints, we're actually pulling in a static HTML file of the rendered page before we're pulling in the client.js bundle. So there will be an instant where the page will load and these buttons will not function. But by the time I even move my mouse over, the JS bundle has come down. We've hydrated the page with the Preact application. And so we've added all of our event listeners and state calls and everything into the DOM. So this is totally search engine indexable, which is the awesome thing. We can control our pages through our Preact source in here. And everything that we put in here is going to be statically generated and will be available for Google's web crawlers to index or DuckDuckGo's crawlers to index, whoever, whatever you want, basically. That's the power of server-side rendering. I'm also looking to introduce some cool features to a project that I'm working on using this tech, where we can have forum posts and stuff like that, and it will pre-render all of the latest forum posts on the server side, which as well will be awesome for SEO, but also awesome for the user because they'll just load the forum and see all of the posts without having to load a forum page and then load in the post data. But yeah, there you go. That's basically it. We can obviously then do an npm run build, which will just run rollup, but not watch. And then we can do an npm start, which, oh, I've started the wrong file. Whoops, that should be build. Catching bugs in the demo. There we go. So now we've got essentially a production built version of this with no sort of watching servers waiting for changes and stuff like that. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to link the repo down below in the comments or description, so check that out, and I hope this might be useful to someone. Peace.